The massive ship called Stellar Dawn moved slowly through the dark space between stars, and its hull reflected the light of distant suns like a mirror made of metal and crystal. Inside the ship, 12 different alien species worked together on their first joint mission to study a new planet that their scouts had found only months ago. The planet had a name now, and they called it Zarian Prime, but nobody knew what dangers waited on its surface. Commander Vexstar stood in the main control room looking at the screens that showed the planet below, and his blue skin had patterns that changed color when he felt worried or excited. He came from a world where the gravity was 3 times stronger than most planets, and his people had evolved to be tall and strong with bones like steel. Next to him stood Dr. Kleith, who looked like a giant insect with 4 arms and compound eyes that could see colors no other species could detect. Her world was hot and dry, and her people had learned to survive in places where water was rare and the sun could kill. On the other side of the room, Shard of Twilight moved like living crystal, and when she spoke, her voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Her people did not have bodies like flesh and blood creatures, but were made of minerals that grew and changed over thousands of years. She had volunteered for this mission because her species wanted to learn about biological life forms that lived and died in what they considered tiny amounts of time. The screens showed data about Zarian Prime, and the numbers made everyone nervous because this planet was more dangerous than any world they had studied before. The air could dissolve most metals in hours, and storms moved across the surface with lightning that was hotter than the cores of some stars. The gravity changed in different areas without warning and could crush a ship or make it float away into space. But the most dangerous thing on the planet was something they had never seen before. Their sensors had found a creature that was bigger and stronger than any predator in their databases, and they had given it the name Zarian Devastator. The creature was 12 feet tall with 6 limbs that ended in claws sharp enough to cut through their ship's armor. It had 4 eyes and a mouth full of teeth that could bite through solid rock. The data showed that this creature was the apex predator of the entire planet, and nothing else could challenge it or survive an attack from it. Jake Martinez walked into the control room, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the simple blue uniform of Earth's Colonial Survey Division. He was 32 years old with brown hair and dark eyes, and when he smiled, the aliens thought he looked friendly but weak. Jake was a xenobiologist, which meant he studied alien life forms, and he was the first human to join a galactic scientific mission. His people had only made contact with the galactic community 2 years ago, and most aliens still did not know much about humans or their abilities. When Jake looked at the data about the Zarian Devastator, he did not seem scared like the other scientists, but instead appeared curious and interested. He asked questions that surprised the aliens because he wanted to know about the creature's behavior patterns and hunting methods rather than just its size and strength. The other scientists had focused on how to avoid the creature, but Jake seemed to want to understand how it thought and moved. Lisa Parker was the only other human on the mission, and she worked as the communications officer who kept contact with Earth and other ships in space. She was 28 years old with blonde hair and blue eyes, and she noticed things that others missed because humans had evolved to read body language and facial expressions. Lisa watched the aliens and saw that they treated Jake like he was made of glass and might break if he fell down or got hurt. The aliens had good reasons to worry about humans because Earth had lower gravity than most of their worlds, and humans did not have natural armor or claws or poison like many galactic species. When they looked at Jake, they saw soft skin and small muscles and bones that seemed too thin to be strong. They knew humans were intelligent, but they thought intelligence was not enough to survive on a planet like Zarian Prime, where even their advanced weapons might not stop the apex predator. Commander Vexstar called a meeting to plan their first expedition to the planet's surface, and every scientist on the team gathered around the large table in the briefing room. The holographic display showed a map of the area where they wanted to land and collect samples. The landing site was in a valley between crystal mountains where the storms were less violent and the gravity was more stable than other places on the planet. Dr. Kleith explained their safety protocols and emergency procedures, and she emphasized that Everyone must stay close to the shuttles and never wander away from the group. If their sensors detected a Zarian Devastator in the area, they would immediately return to the ship and abort the mission. The creature was too dangerous to risk an encounter, and their orders were clear about avoiding any contact with the apex predator. Jake listened to the briefing and made notes on his tablet, but he also studied the behavior patterns they had recorded. From orbit, he noticed that the Zarian Devastator only hunted during certain times and seemed to follow specific routes through its territory. The creature was intelligent enough to use tools and set traps for its prey, which meant it could think and plan like a sentient being. When the briefing ended, the team began preparing their equipment and supplies for the expedition, and Jake packed his gear differently than the others. While they loaded heavy weapons and thick armor, he chose lighter tools and simple instruments for measuring and recording. Lisa asked him why he was not taking more protection, and Jake smiled and said he preferred to move quickly and quietly rather than rely on weapons and shields. The night before their departure, Jake stood in the observation deck looking down at Zarian Prime and its swirling storms, and Lisa joined him there. She asked if he was nervous about facing the most dangerous predator in the galaxy, and Jake said he was more excited than scared because every creature had weaknesses and patterns that could be understood. He told her that humans had survived on Earth by learning to outsmart predators that were bigger and stronger than they were. The shuttles dropped through the thick atmosphere of Zarian Prime, like metal teardrops falling through acid rain, and Jake felt the ship shake as they passed through layers of toxic clouds. The pilot was a Zephyrian named Cordoval who had flown through asteroid fields and solar storms, but he gripped the controls tightly as they descended toward the planet's surface. Through the small windows, Jake could see lightning that was bright purple and green dancing between the clouds, and he wondered what kind of energy could create such colors. When they finally broke through the lowest cloud layer, the landscape below looked like nothing Jake had ever seen before, and he pressed his face against the window to get a better view. Crystal trees stretched up toward the sky like frozen waterfalls, and their surfaces reflected the strange light from above in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The ground was covered with what looked like grass, but Jake could see that each blade had edges sharp enough to cut skin, and the wind made them move like tiny knives swaying in a deadly breeze. Commander Vexstar's voice came through the comm system, telling everyone to check their environmental suits one more time before landing, and Jake made sure his helmet was sealed properly. The air outside contained acids that could dissolve human lungs in minutes, and the pressure was different enough to cause problems without protection. Dr. reminded them that their boots had special solace to prevent the sharp grass from cutting through, but they should still be careful where they stepped. The shuttle landed with a soft thud on a flat area between the crystal trees, and Jake felt the gravity pull at him differently than he expected. It was not just stronger or weaker than Earth gravity, but seemed to shift and change like it could not make up its mind about which direction was down. When the doors opened, Jake was the first one to step outside, and he immediately noticed things that the others missed because he had learned to pay attention to small details. The way the crystal trees leaned told him which direction the strongest winds usually came from, and the patterns in the sharp grass showed him where larger animals had walked recently. There were no sounds of birds or insects, but Jake could hear a low humming that seemed to come from the crystals themselves, and he realized they were vibrating at frequencies too low for most species to detect. His human ears could pick up these sounds because humans had evolved to hear a wider range of frequencies than many other species. Lisa stayed close to the shuttles, operating the communication equipment that kept them in contact with the stellar dawn orbiting high above. She watched Jake as he moved away from the landing site, studying the strange plants and recording data on his tablet. The other alien scientists stayed in a tight group and moved slowly because their heavy armor and weapons made them clumsy, but Jake seemed to flow through the environment like he belonged there. Dr. Click used her 4 arms to operate multiple scanning devices at once, and she was amazed by the readings she was getting from the planet's ecosystem. Every plant and mineral contained elements that did not exist anywhere else in the galaxy, and some of them seemed to violate the basic laws of chemistry. She called to Jake, asking him to come back closer to the group, but he was already 50 meters away, examining a cluster of crystal flowers that grew from cracks in the rocky ground. Jake knelt down next to the crystal flowers and noticed that they turned to follow his movement like they were watching him, and when he held out his hand, one of them actually reached toward him with what looked like curiosity. He spoke softly to Lisa through his cum, telling her that the local life forms seemed more interested than afraid of humans, and she recorded this observation in her notes. The alien scientists were keeping their distance from everything on the planet, but the plants and small creatures seemed drawn to Jake's presence. On the second day of their expedition, Jake discovered something that made everyone stop what they were doing and pay attention to him. He found tracks in the soft ground near a stream of liquid that was too thick to be water and too thin to be mud. The tracks were huge and showed the distinctive pattern of 6 limbs with claws, but they were not fresh enough to be dangerous. Jake studied the tracks and told the team that the creature who made them had been injured because one of the back limbs was not putting full weight on the ground. Commander Vexstar asked Jake how he could possibly know such specific information from just looking at tracks in the dirt, and Jake explained that humans had learned to read signs like this during their evolution. He showed them how the depth of each footprint told a story about the creature's weight distribution and movement patterns. The injured limb meant this particular Zarian Devastator was not at full strength and might be more cautious than usual. About hunting. Shard of Twilight was fascinated by Jake's ability to interpret what she thought was just random marks in the ground, and she asked him to teach her how to read tracks the way humans did. Jake spent an hour showing her the difference between fresh tracks and old ones, and how to tell if a creature was running or walking or stalking prey. She recorded everything he said because her crystal memory could store information perfectly for thousands of years. As they moved deeper into the crystal forest, Jake continued to notice details that the advanced alien sensors missed completely. He pointed out scratch marks on tree trunks that showed territorial boundaries and warned the team away from areas where the grass grew in specific patterns that indicated underground dangers. The aliens began to realize that their sophisticated technology was not as useful as Jake's simple ability to observe and understand what he was seeing. Lisa watched the alien scientists becoming more and more impressed with Jake's skills, and she felt proud that humans were proving their worth on this dangerous mission. She had grown up hearing stories about how humans were weak compared to other galactic species, but Jake was showing them that intelligence and awareness could be more valuable than strength or armor. When she reported back to the Stellar Dawn, she made sure to include details about Jake's contributions to the mission. On the third day, Jake woke up before sunrise and stepped outside the protective barriers around their camp to watch the strange dawn colors paint the crystal trees in shades of orange and purple. The air was still and quiet except for the low humming of the crystals, and Jake felt more at peace than he had since leaving Earth. He did not notice the massive shape moving silently through the trees behind him until Lisa's voice screamed through his cum, telling him to run. The Zarian Devastator had found their camp, and it was bigger and more terrible than any of their scans had suggested. Jake turned around slowly and found himself face to face with the apex predator of an alien world, and he realized that all their careful planning and safety protocols had just become completely useless. The creature's 4 eyes focused on him with intelligent malice, and Jake could see that it was not just a mindless beast, but a thinking predator that had been hunting them since they arrived. The Zarian Devastator stood between the crystal trees like a nightmare made of flesh and bone and claws, and Jake could smell its breath, which was hot and metallic like heated copper. The creature was even larger than their sensors had indicated, and its 6 limbs were thick with muscles that rippled under armored skin that looked harder than steel. Each of its 4 eyes was the size of Jake's fist, and they all focused on him with the kind of intelligence that made his skin crawl, because this was not just an animal but a thinking predator that understood exactly what it was looking at. Behind Jake, the camp erupted into chaos as the alien scientists activated their emergency protocols and energy shields began to hum and glow around the shuttles. Commander Vexstar's voice boomed through the comm system, ordering everyone to retreat to the ships immediately, while Dr. Clyke's Four arms moved frantically over her weapon controls, trying to get a target lock on the massive creature. Shard of Twilight began transmitting what she believed would be their final research data back to the Stellar Dawn because she was certain they were all about to die. The Zarian Devastator opened its mouth, and Jake could see rows of teeth that were designed to crush bone and tear flesh, and each tooth was as long as his finger and sharp enough to cut through their shuttle's hull. The creature's tongue was dark purple and moved like a snake as it tasted the air, and Jake realized it was analyzing his scent to determine what kind of threat he might pose. Saliva dripped from its jaws, and where it hit the ground, the crystal grass dissolved with a hissing sound that made Jake's blood run cold. Lisa's voice screamed through Jake's, telling him to run toward the shuttles, where the others could protect him with their weapons and shields, but Jake did not move toward safety. Instead, he began walking slowly toward the Zarian Devastator with his hands raised and empty and visible. The alien scientists watched in horror as their supposedly fragile human companion approached the most dangerous predator in the known galaxy like he was going for a casual stroll through a park on Earth. Commander Vexstar shouted orders for Jake to retreat immediately, but Jake reached up and turned off his cum so he could concentrate without distractions. He began removing his protective gear piece by piece and letting it fall to the ground until he wore only his basic clothing and boots. The aliens could not understand why Jake was making himself more vulnerable when he should be seeking protection, and Dr. H calculated that their combined firepower had only a 23% chance of stopping the creature before it reached them. The Zarian Devastator watched Jake's strange behavior with what seemed like curiosity, and it tilted its massive head to one side like it was trying to understand what this small soft creature was doing. Jake moved with deliberate slowness and kept his breathing steady and calm while he studied every detail of the predator's body and posture. He noticed how it distributed its weight on its 6 limbs and where its joints bent and how its muscles tensed when it prepared to move. Jake had spent years studying predators on Earth and other worlds, and he understood that every creature, no matter how large or dangerous, had weaknesses built into its design by evolution. The Zarian Devastator was incredibly powerful, but it was also heavy, and its great size meant it could not change direction quickly once it committed to an attack. Its 6 limbs gave it stability, but also made its movement patterns predictable because it had to coordinate more joints and muscles than simpler creatures. The creature's 4 eyes were an advantage for hunting, but they also created blind spots where the fields of vision overlapped, and Jake could see exactly where those blind spots were located. The armored skin that protected it from energy weapons also made it slower and less flexible than unarmored creatures, and Jake began to see opportunities that the alien scientists, with all their advanced technology, had completely missed. Behind him, Lisa was broadcasting a desperate message to the Stellar Dawn, requesting immediate evacuation while the other scientists prepared to make their final stand against the apex predator. They could not understand why Jake was approaching the creature instead of running away, and Commander Vexstar was preparing to stun Jake with a paralysis beam and drag him to safety, even if it meant revealing their position to the predator. The Zarian Devastator had been watching Jake for almost a full minute, and it seemed to decide that this strange small creature was not a threat worth considering. It turned its attention toward the shuttles, where the real prey was hiding behind their energy shields and bright weapons. The creature's muscles bunched as it prepared to charge toward the camp, and Jake knew he had only seconds before it would attack his friends and colleagues. Jake suddenly sprinted forward directly at the Zarian Devastator, and the aliens watched in stunned silence as their human teammate ran straight toward certain death. The creature spun around to face this unexpected attack, and its 4 eyes widened with what might have been surprise, because no prey had ever voluntarily approached it before. It opened its massive jaws and prepared to snap Jake in half with one bite, but Jake was not where the creature expected him to be. At the last possible moment, Jake threw himself to the side and rolled under the creature's massive body, while it was still turning to follow his movement. The Zarian Devastator's reflexes were incredibly fast, but Jake had calculated its reaction time and moved at precisely the right moment to avoid its snapping jaws. He came up behind the creature's left rear limb, and before it could turn around, he wrapped his arms around one of its legs just above what looked like an ankle joint. The creature tried to shake Jake off, but he held on tight and used his knowledge of anatomy and physics to find the pressure point where nerves ran close to the surface. Jake pressed his fingers into the spot with all his strength, and the Zarian Devastator's leg went numb and collapsed under its weight. The massive predator stumbled and fell to one knee, giving Jake the opportunity he needed to move to his next target. While the creature was off balance, Jake scrambled up its back using its own armor plates as handholds, and the aliens watched in amazement as their fragile human teammate climbed the most dangerous predator in the galaxy like it was a jungle. The Zarian Devastator thrashed and rolled, trying to dislodge Jake, but he moved with the creature's motion and stayed just out of reach of its claws and teeth. Jake found another pressure point at the base of the creature's skull and applied steady pressure until the predator's movements began to slow and become unsteady. Dr. Clythe's sensors recorded everything, but her scientific mind could not process what she was seeing because it violated every principle of predator and prey relationships that she understood. Commander Vexstar lowered his weapons because he realized that shooting at the creature might hit Jake, who was still clinging to its back. Shard of Twilight stopped transmitting final messages and began recording what she was certain would be the most important scientific observation of her very long life. Jake held tight to the nerve cluster at the base of the Zarian Devastator's skull and felt the creature's movements becoming sluggish and confused as the pressure point disrupted signals between its brain and muscles. The massive predator shook its head violently, trying to dislodge him, but Jake had positioned himself in the one spot where the creature could not reach him with any of its 6 limbs or its snapping jaws. He had studied the scans of this species for days and memorized every joint and muscle attachment until he knew its anatomy better than the creature knew itself. The Zarian Devastator tried to roll over to crush Jake beneath its weight, but Jake released his grip and dropped to the ground just as the creature committed to the movement. While the predator was upside down and vulnerable, Jake grabbed one of its middle limbs and twisted it in a direction that the joint was not designed to bend. He did not try to break the limb because that would cause unnecessary pain, but instead applied steady pressure to the ligaments until the creature's own weight and momentum did the work for him. The alien scientists watched in stunned silence as Jake moved around the thrashing predator like he was performing a carefully choreographed dance, and every step seemed to be planned several moves ahead. Dr. Clythe's sensors recorded Jake's heart rate and breathing, and she was amazed to discover that he was completely calm and his vital signs showed no stress or fear. Commander Vexstar had seen warriors from a dozen different species face dangerous creatures, but none of them had ever moved with the kind of precision and confidence that Jake displayed. Jake rolled under the creature again as it tried to right itself, and this time he targeted the tendons in its rear legs that controlled its ability to jump and charge. He used his thumbs to press against specific points where the tendons were closest to the surface and held the pressure until he felt them relax and go slack. The Zarian Devastator tried to leap toward the shuttles where the other humans and aliens were watching, but its powerful legs would not respond properly, and it stumbled and fell forward onto its chest. The massive predator was becoming frustrated and angry because nothing like this had ever happened to it before, and its roar of rage echoed off the crystal trees and made the ground shake under everyone's feet. Jake could see that the creature was starting to panic as it realized that its strength and weapons were useless against an opponent who understood its weaknesses better than it understood itself. The predator's 4 eyes darted around looking for an escape route, but Jake had positioned himself to block every direction where it might try to flee. Jake approached the creature's head while it was down and vulnerable, and for a moment the aliens thought he was going to try to kill it with his bare hands. Instead, Jake knelt down next to the Zarian Devastator's massive skull and began speaking to it in a soft, calm voice that somehow seemed to penetrate the creature's rage and confusion. He placed one hand gently on the side of its head just behind one of its eyes, and the predator's thrashing began to slow as Jake continued to speak in soothing tones. Lisa could not hear what Jake was saying through the cum system, but she could see that the creature was responding to his voice and presence in a way that seemed almost impossible. The Zarian Devastator's breathing slowed and its eyes stopped, darting around frantically, and instead focused on Jake's face with what looked like curiosity rather than hatred. Jake continued to speak softly while he applied gentle pressure to another nerve cluster that would help the creature relax without causing any permanent damage. The predator tried once more to snap at Jake with its massive jaws, but the movement was half-hearted and slow, and Jake easily avoided the attack while maintaining contact with the pressure point behind its eye. He could feel the creature's pulse through his fingertips, and he matched his breathing to its rhythm until both human and predator were breathing in perfect synchronization. The aliens watching from the shuttles had never seen anything like this display of interspecies communication and control. Jake gradually moved his hands to different pressure points around the creature's head and neck, and each touch seemed to drain more of the fight out of the massive predator. He found the spots where blood vessels ran close to the surface and applied just enough pressure to slow the flow of blood to the creature's brain without cutting it off completely. The Zarian Devastator's eyelids began to droop as Jake guided it toward unconsciousness with the same gentle efficiency he had used to disable its ability to fight. Commander Vexstar realized that Jake was not trying to kill the creature, but was instead using some kind of advanced technique to render it harmless without causing permanent injury. He had never seen or heard of any species that possessed this kind of knowledge about biological systems and pressure points and nerve clusters. Dr. Kleith was frantically recording every movement Jake made because she knew she was witnessing something that would revolutionize their understanding of interspecies combat and biological manipulation. Within 10 minutes of the initial encounter, the Zarian Devastator was lying unconscious on the ground, breathing steadily but unable to move or wake up, and Jake stood over it looking completely uninjured and barely breathing hard from his efforts. He had taken the most dangerous predator on the planet and rendered it harmless using nothing but his understanding of anatomy and biomechanics and psychological manipulation. The aliens could not comprehend how their supposedly fragile human teammate had accomplished something that their advanced weapons and technology could not have achieved. Jake walked calmly back toward the shuttles while the alien scientists stared at him in shocked silence, and when he reached Lisa, she threw her arms around him and held him tight while tears ran down her face inside her helmet. She had been certain that she was about to watch her friend and colleague get torn apart by the apex predator, but instead, she had witnessed the most incredible display of human capability that she had ever seen or imagined possible. Dr. Kleith approached Jake with her scanner running, and she examined him from head to toe looking for injuries or signs of stress, but found nothing except slightly elevated adrenaline levels that were already returning to normal. She asked Jake how he had known exactly which pressure points to target, and how he had calculated the creature's movement patterns so precisely. Jake smiled and told her that humans had been doing this kind of thing for thousands of years, and it was just a matter of understanding how bodies worked and using that knowledge effectively. Shard of Twilight floated over to examine the unconscious Zarian Devastator, and her crystalline sensors confirmed that the creature was unharmed, but would remain unconscious for several hours. She asked Jake if he had killed it or just rendered it temporarily helpless, and Jake explained that the creature would wake up confused but uninjured and would probably avoid humans in the future because it would remember that they were not easy prey. The unconscious predator lay peacefully in the crystal grass while the alien scientists tried to process what they had just witnessed, and Jake began collecting his discarded equipment and putting his protective gear back on. He acted like he had just completed a routine task rather than something that would change how the entire galaxy viewed humanity and their place in the cosmic community of intelligent species. Jake sat on a crystal rock near the unconscious Zarian Devastator and began explaining to the alien scientists how he had been able to defeat the most dangerous predator on the planet without using any weapons or technology. Commander Vexstar and Dr. Kleith H. and Shard of Twilight gathered around him in a semicircle like students listening to a teacher, and their questions came so fast that Jake had to hold up his hand to slow them down so he could answer each one properly. Dr. Click wanted to know how Jake had identified the pressure points so quickly, and Jake told her that humans had spent thousands of years studying anatomy and fighting techniques in martial arts that taught them to use an opponent's strength against itself. He explained that every creature with a nervous system had vulnerable spots, where nerves ran close to the surface and where joints could be manipulated beyond their natural range of motion. A key was understanding biomechanics and physics and knowing exactly where and how to apply pressure. Commander Vextar asked Jake how he had known that the Zarian Devastator would react the way it did, and Jake smiled and began telling them about human evolution and how his species had survived on a planet full of predators that were bigger and stronger and faster than they were. He explained that humans had developed persistence hunting techniques where they would chase prey animals for hours or days until the animals collapsed from exhaustion while the humans were still able to continue running. Jake told them about the African savanna where his ancestors had learned to read tracks and predict animal behavior and outsmart creatures that could kill them easily in a direct confrontation. He described how early humans had used their intelligence and endurance and ability to work together to bring down mammoths and saber-toothed cats and other predators that seemed impossible to defeat. The aliens listened with growing amazement, as Jake explained that humans had become the apex predators on Earth, not through strength but through superior tactics and strategy. Shard of Twilight asked Jake about the psychological aspects of what he had done and how he had been able to calm the Zarian Devastator after disabling its ability to fight. Jake explained that humans had evolved as social animals who needed to understand the emotions and intentions of other creatures in order to survive. He told her that body language and vocal tones and breathing patterns were universal communication methods that worked across species barriers because all living creatures shared certain basic responses to stress and fear and pain. Jake described how human soldiers and law enforcement officers were trained to de-escalate dangerous situations using voice control and psychological manipulation rather than violence whenever possible. He explained that the same techniques that worked on angry humans could often be adapted to work on other species because fear and aggression followed predictable patterns in most biological creatures. The aliens had never considered that psychology could be used as a weapon or tool for controlling dangerous animals. Lisa recorded everything Jake said because she knew that this information would be incredibly valuable to Earth's xenobiological research programs, and she wanted to make sure that every detail was preserved for future study. She asked Jake to explain more about human martial arts, and he told the aliens about disciplines like Aikido and Jiu-Jitsu that taught practitioners to redirect an attacker's energy rather than meeting force with force. He demonstrated some basic moves using Commander Vextar as a volunteer and showed how leverage and balance could overcome superior strength. Dr. Clyde H. was fascinated by Jake's explanation of human sensory capabilities, and she ran detailed scans of his nervous system while he spoke. She discovered that humans could process sensory information much faster than most species and that their brains were wired to recognize patterns and make predictions about future events based on minimal data. Jake's ability to read the Zarian Devastator's intentions and movement patterns was not supernatural but was instead the result of millions of years of evolution that had shaped human brains for survival and adaptation. Jake told them about human endurance and how his species could maintain physical and mental activity for much longer periods than most other creatures. He explained that humans were designed for persistence rather than brief bursts of maximum effort, and that this gave them advantages in situations that required sustained concentration and problem-solving under pressure. The aliens began to understand that they had completely misjudged human capabilities because they had focused on raw physical strength rather than endurance and mental flexibility. Commander Vextar asked Jake about human military tactics and strategy, and Jake described how human armies had learned to defeat enemies that outnumbered them or possessed superior weapons through the use of intelligence and deception and psychological warfare. He told them about guerrilla tactics and asymmetrical warfare where smaller forces could defeat larger ones by avoiding direct confrontation and instead targeting weaknesses and supply lines and morale. The aliens realized that they had been thinking about humans in completely the wrong way, and that their assumptions about human fragility were based on incomplete information. Jake explained that humans preferred to avoid violence whenever possible, but when they were forced to fight, they used every advantage they could find, including their opponent's overconfidence and predictable behavior patterns. He told them that the Zarian Devastator had been defeated primarily by its own assumptions about what humans were capable of. Shard of Twilight asked Jake if all humans possessed these abilities, and Jake told her that the basic capabilities were present in every human, but that they required training and practice to develop fully. He explained that human children learn to read body language and facial expressions from birth, and that they were taught to recognize patterns and solve problems from a very early age. The specific techniques he had used against the Zarian Devastator were more advanced, but they built on instincts and abilities that were present in every member of his species. Dr. Click wanted to know if humans had encountered species similar to the Zarian Devastator on Earth, and Jake told her about bears and big cats and other apex predators that early humans had learned to avoid or defeat using intelligence rather than strength. He explained that every predator had specific behavior patterns and weaknesses that could be exploited by creatures that were smart enough to observe and analyze and adapt their tactics accordingly. As Jake continued his explanation, the alien scientists began to see humans in a completely different light, and they realized that their species might be far more dangerous and capable than anyone in the galactic community had imagined. Commander Vexstar was already composing a message to the Galactic Council, requesting an immediate review of humanity's classification and status within the interstellar community, because it was clear that they had seriously underestimated what humans were capable of accomplishing. The unconscious Zarian Devastator began to stir, and Jake stood up and moved everyone back to a safe distance while the massive predator slowly regained consciousness. When the creature's 4 eyes opened, it looked around confused and disoriented, and when it saw Jake standing nearby, it made no aggressive moves but instead backed away, slowly, like it remembered what had happened and wanted no part of another encounter with the strange human who had defeated it so easily. The journey back to the stellar dawn was quiet except for the hum of the shuttle engines and the occasional whispered conversation between the alien scientists, who were still trying to process what they had witnessed on Zarian Prime. Jake sat near the window looking down at the planet's surface as they climbed through the toxic atmosphere, and he seemed completely relaxed, like he had just finished a routine day of fieldwork, rather than something that would change how the entire galaxy viewed humanity. Dr. Kleith spent the entire flight analyzing the recordings she had made of Jake's encounter with the Zarian Devastator, and her 4 arms moved constantly over her instruments as she tried to understand the biomechanical principles behind what the human had accomplished. She had studied predator and prey relationships for most of her long career, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she had seen today. The data showed that Jake had used precise applications of force at specific anatomical points to disable a creature that outweighed him by more than 10 to 1. Commander Vexstar was composing a detailed report to the Galactic Council, and he found himself struggling to find words that would adequately describe what had happened without sounding like he was telling fantasy stories. He knew that most species in the galactic community would find his account impossible to believe because it contradicted everything they thought they knew about human capabilities and limitations. The video recordings would be essential to proving that this had actually happened. Shard of Twilight floated silently in her section of the shuttle, processing the implications of what she had witnessed, and her crystalline mind was working through thousands of possible scenarios and outcomes. Her species lived for millennia and thought in terms of centuries, and she could see that this single event might mark a turning point in galactic civilization. The other species had welcomed humans into the community as junior partners, but that relationship was about to change dramatically. When they docked with the stellar dawn, the news of Jake's encounter spread through the ship within minutes, and crew members from all 12 species came to see the human who had defeated an apex predator with his bare hands. Jake was uncomfortable with all the attention, and he tried to explain that what he had done was not really that extraordinary, by human standards, but the aliens could not accept this modest assessment of his accomplishments. Lisa found herself answering dozens of questions from curious aliens who wanted to know if all humans possessed Jake's abilities, and she tried to explain that while not every human was trained in martial arts and pressure point techniques, the basic capabilities were present in their entire species. She told them about human athletes and soldiers and martial artists who could perform feats that would seem impossible to other species, and she realized that humanity had been seriously underestimated by the galactic community. The ship's medical officer was a being that looked like a walking tree with silver bark and golden leaves, and she insisted on examining Jake to determine if he had been injured during his encounter with the Predator. Her scans showed that Jake had suffered no damage whatsoever and that his stress levels were actually lower than they had been before the mission began. She had never seen any creature remain so calm during a life-threatening encounter, and she asked Jake to explain how he had controlled his fear and adrenaline responses. Jake told her that humans were taught from childhood to manage their emotional reactions during dangerous situations and that panic was often more deadly than whatever threat they were facing. He explained that military training and martial arts disciplines included extensive psychological conditioning to help practitioners remain calm and focused under extreme stress. The medical officer was fascinated to learn that humans could consciously control their autonomic nervous system responses to a degree that most species could not achieve. Dr. Clyde H. called a meeting of the entire science team to discuss the implications of Jake's demonstration, and she began by proposing a complete revision of humanity's classification in the Galactic Species Database. She suggested creating a new category called Adaptive Apex Analysts to describe species that achieved predator status through superior intelligence and tactical thinking rather than physical dominance or advanced technology. The other scientists agreed that the current classification system was inadequate for describing human capabilities, and they began working on new categories that would more accurately reflect what they had learned. Commander Vextar pointed out that if one human could defeat the most dangerous predator on Zarian Prime, then humanity as a whole might possess military and strategic capabilities that had been completely overlooked by the Galactic Defense Forces. Jake participated in the discussion, but he kept emphasizing that his techniques were not secret or mysterious, but were based on scientific principles that could be taught to other species. He offered to demonstrate pressure point techniques and biomechanical leverage principles to anyone who was interested in learning, and several of the alien scientists immediately volunteered to be his students. Jake was pleased that his knowledge could be shared and adapted to help other species defend themselves. Over the next several days, Jake conducted training sessions where he taught basic martial arts principles and anatomical knowledge to his alien colleagues, and they were amazed by how much more effective they became when they understood the scientific principles behind combat techniques. Dr. Clyde H. proved to be an excellent student because her forearms gave her advantages in applying multiple pressure points simultaneously, and Commander Vextar's natural strength became much more effective when he learned to use leverage and timing. Shard of Twilight was particularly interested in the psychological aspects of Jake's techniques, and she spent hours learning about human methods for reading body language and predicting behavior patterns. Her crystalline memory allowed her to store and analyze thousands of examples, and she became expert at recognizing the subtle signs that indicated when a creature was about to attack or flee or submit. The reports from the Zarian Prime mission reached Earth several weeks later, and Jake found himself becoming famous throughout human space as news of his encounter spread through the colonies and research stations. He received hundreds of requests for interviews and demonstrations, but he preferred to focus on his scientific work and continue developing techniques that could be used by other species for peaceful purposes. Lisa was promoted to head of xenobiological communications, and she worked closely with Jake to develop training programs that could be shared with the galactic community. They created educational materials that explained human evolutionary history and survival techniques in ways that other species could understand and adapt to their own needs and circumstances. The galactic community's perception of humanity changed completely as word spread about what had happened on Zarian Prime, and requests began coming in from dozens of species, who wanted human advisors to help them deal with dangerous predators and hostile environments on their own worlds. Humans went from being seen as the fragile newcomers who needed protection to being recognized as valuable allies whose unique abilities could benefit the entire galactic civilization. Jake continued his work as a xenobiologist, but now he led teams that included representatives from multiple species, who were eager to learn from the human perspective on survival and adaptation. He never forgot that his success on Zarian Prime had been possible because he understood that every creature, no matter how dangerous, had weaknesses that could be discovered through careful observation and scientific analysis, and that intelligence would always be more powerful than brute force when applied correctly.